Chapter 8. William, Linus and Frederic arrived at the guru Gabriel's house. Many light beings had gathered in his garden to hear him speak. Gabriel was glad to see them return and welcomed Frederic to his humble residency. They reunited with Kenneth and Lyra, who wanted to hear about their journey to the science center. They had talked with beings coming from the town square and the concert venue, and the beings said that they had been told that the guru would help them with reversion. Kenneth and Lyra were proud of William and Linus for initiating the beings' trials, and now they were in the right place for their further development. William and Linus were happy that they were able to convince the beings, and they looked forward to receive the teachings that would allow them to pass their trial. William told Gabriel that they had found out the physical origin of consciousness, in that it arose from quantum fluctuations, and in turn determined the behavior of these fluctuations through contemplation of the One. Gabriel was intrigued. William added that the world soul's emanation determined the strength of potential energy, which determined the fundamental forces of nature. Furthermore, the material world's epistrophe determined how much the particles spread out. Gabriel asked if the philosophy made sense of what had happened to their world. William confirmed that it did, which delighted Gabriel. William said that it seemed like in their world, the world soul's emanation and material world's epistrophe had both diminished in intensity, and in an alternative world, where the stonified people could have survived, the intensity was strengthened instead. He said that the trial was not as simple as gaining or losing spiritual mass, since, if they would gain spiritual mass in their world, they would simply turn into stonified people. And the stonified people in their respective world, if they would lose spiritual mass, they would simply evaporate. Linus asked a question about where the material world was contained. Gabriel explained that in reality, the material world was not contained anywhere, and its spatial extension was merely an illusion and a shadow of the non-extended world soul. Frederic stepped in and said that there was physical evidence for that claim when one considered the vacuum state. He explained that the Reeh-Schlieder theorem showed that the global vacuum state was maximally entangled with respect to the partition of any spatial region of space and its complementary region. Especially, the global vacuum could not be factorized into separate pure states for the two regions. In contrast, randomly selected particle pairs in the universe that had never interacted or been prepared in a shared quantum state were by definition not entangled. Quantum fluctuations were simply intrinsic parts of a single highly entangled quantum field, namely the vacuum state. Frederic argued that the guarantee of maximal entanglement of the global vacuum state provided an argument that quantum fluctuations were in reality not extended, but a phenomena of a larger unity. Linus still argued that quantum fluctuations were extended in time, even though they were not extended in space. Gabriel explained that Nous contemplated all the forms simultaneously in a state of eternal perfection. The world soul, however, did not rest in this simultaneous perfection. In its emanation from the Nous, it introduced movement and a desire to perceive the whole of the Nous content one after another. However, as space was an illusion in the material world, so was time an illusion for the world soul. Time was a shadow of the temporal unified Nous. They knew that the awareness caused quantum fluctuations, so that the material world was filled with possibilities. Linus asked how exactly quantum fluctuations participated in the motion of particles. Frederic explained that deterministically explaining the motion of particles required a potential which they now knew was entirely determined by the world soul's emanation. However, he explained, quantum mechanics could be seen as a stochastic process, where the wave function psi of a particle with mass m could be determined by a probability density ρ, and a phase s. The stochastic relation was made with the equation for the current velocity pmb_v equals frac1m nabla s equals pmb mu pmb u, where pmb mu represented the forward drift of the particle and pmb u represented the osmotic velocity. The forward drift pmb mu was the mean velocity of the particle's displacement at a given position that determined the future trajectory of the particle, which was in part determined by the potential. The osmotic velocity pmb u equals d nabla ln rho was the mean velocity component associated with the diffusion of the particle's probability density that determined the spreading or contraction of the probability density. D was the diffusion coefficient that determined the strength of the particle's random, Brownian-like motion. The value of d exactly described how real particles interacted with quantum fluctuations to create randomness, and they would spread out due to this. Frederic revealed that its value was d equals frac h bar 2m, which was exactly proportional to h bar, which Gabriel's philosophy associated with the material world's epistrophe. Linus asked how the interactions with quantum fluctuations could be imagined. Frederic explained it was like having a point-like particle with a certain chance of going right and a certain chance frac 13f I of going left. But there was always a zero chance of staying where it was, so the probability of going in any direction in three-dimensional space added up to 1. He explained that when one started from that discrete example and took the limit as the time tended to 0, it created a continuum formulation and yielded the continuity equation, describing how the probability density ρ evolved in time. Frac partial ρ partial t equals nabla dot rop mu d nabla ρ equals nabla c dot ρ pmbv. One would find that pmb mu equals 12d operator named left, frac partial pmb f partial delta pmb r right delta r equals pmb 0, and d equals frac 118, lim delta tto 0 frac langle delta pmb r2 wrangle delta t, in the case for isotropic diffusion. Then using the Newton's second law, mpmb equals nabla v1, could derive the stochastic Hamilton-Jacobi equation. One simply constructed the stochastic acceleration as pmb equals frac 12 d plus pmbb plus dpmbb plus, where dpm equals frac partial t plus pmbb pmc dot nablapm d nabla 2 and pmbb pm equals pmb vpm pmb u. The continuity equation and the Hamilton-Jacobi equation was what was needed to reconstruct the time-dependent Schrödinger equation for the wave function. Psi equals sqrt rho ei sh bar. He concluded that the underlying potential and the interactions with random quantum fluctuations in an isotropic vacuum created the stochastic dynamics which governed quantum mechanics. It seemed to William that quantum fluctuations penetrated everything in a way that consciousness was fundamental to all matter. Gabriel confirmed that quantum fluctuations' mind was a brilliant candidate for the Panpsychism philosophy, which posited that consciousness was everywhere. The consequence of this was that all awareness was rooted in the global awareness, and therefore no awareness was truly individual. It was not that a rock itself was aware, but the space it inhabited was aware because of the background quantum fluctuations which gave rise to awareness. True awareness could not be granted from complex material processes, but was given by interactions with quantum fluctuations. Gabriel concluded that for them to pass their trials, they would have to tap into the awareness which was provided by quantum fluctuations. Gabriel continued explaining the layers of consciousness. He said that consciousness was a function which had potential for thought and sensation based on experiences, but it was not necessary for consciousness to be aware of these, since an experience could either be aware or non-aware. Responsiveness was a reaction to an experience. This reaction must build on free will, which was only possible for a conscious mind. He started explaining vegetative consciousness. This represented an unconscious mind, a mind with no awareness. This consciousness could only be non-responsive since it was not conscious. It was the lowest level of consciousness on the scale. Individuals in a vegetative state were awake but lacked awareness, meaning they were not consciously interacting with their external surroundings, nor did they have internal self-awareness. He then explained that responsive consciousness represented all types of responsive awareness. It referred to a state where an individual was actively aware of and engaged with their surroundings, reacting to stimuli inwardly or outwardly and processing information in real time. Responsive consciousness was a state of active awareness, where individuals interacted with the environment, performing higher cognitive functions such as decision-making, problem-solving, and real-time reactions. Based on free will. He explained that while universal consciousness in panpsychism may be minimal or basic, it still implied the existence of some basic form of awareness or potential for experience. If simpler entities lacked any form of awareness, they could not contribute to the emergence of higher-order consciousness. However, even though there were minimal awareness in quantum fluctuations, they did not contribute to the material world's mind as it was totally unconscious and mechanical. The reversionists looked confused. William asked if the material world's mind was unconscious, then how could it contemplate the one? He thought that required reflective conscious considerations. Gabriel had not thought of that problem and told William he was right in that contemplation required awareness. Frederic said that a non-zero H-bar required non-zero epistrophe from the material world's mind, but epistrophe through contemplation could not be achieved through an unconscious mind. Gabriel agreed with them in that it looked paradoxical, but he assured them that all hypostases had some kind of return towards the one, unconscious or not, though the material world's epistrophe was purely mechanical except when practiced by conscious minds within the material world. He proceeded to say that since the world soul, nous, the one, and conscious individuals were all aware, they could not be equated with vegetative consciousness, which lacked any form of awareness or conscious experience. He then argued that since the world soul, nous, and had a conscious mind, they had free will, and conscious individuals did not necessarily follow the will of the one, so they must be responsive consciousnesses. The one was not a mind, so it had no free will since it had nothing to be free from. Therefore the one must fall under the third category, which was meditative consciousness. This represented an awareness in a non-responsive manner. It was experienced as a state of pure consciousness or witnessing, where the meditator became a passive observer of their perception, watching thoughts arise and pass without attachment. It was not focused on making responses to stimuli as responsive consciousness was. Instead, meditative consciousness was characterized by mental stillness, detachment from distractions, and non-reactivity. By defining the one as meditative, he posited that the foundational state of all consciousness was one of pure, undisturbed awareness. This aligned with descriptions of meditative consciousness, where there was presence without judgment, reaction, or division. In this state, consciousness existed as a kind of undivided potential, a field of awareness that was conscious but not actively engaged with or differentiated within itself. The one did not engage in the way a mind did. Instead, it passively observed, embodying pure, detached awareness. The one in this sense functioned as a witness within the field of experience. He explained how the one as meditative consciousness could be seen as the foundation upon which all other levels of consciousness build. While minds, bodies, and environments brought movement, change, and form, the one itself remained as a silent witness, untouched and unchanging. Thus, individual awareness was like a wave of awareness arising from this meditative field. The one, as meditative consciousness, grounded these individual forms, but itself remained non-dual and undivided, providing a stable, ever-present background. It seemed like what all conscious beings inherited from the one was the awareness of things. Frederic raised the question of about the nature of the one's observation if the one was a constant observer. William remembered reading about George Berkeley, who argued that material objects did not exist independently of perception. For example, if one would light a candle and then leave the room, and after a while return, the candle would not have burned down since no one would be able to observe it. Reality consisted of ideas perceived by minds, and a constant observer ensured the persistence of objects when no human observer was present. This argument suggested that for things to exist or continue to follow natural laws in the absence of human observation, a constant observer was necessary. It presumed that observation was a fundamental requirement for sustaining reality. Frederic was curious about the nature of the observation since the quantum Zeno effect was relevant and could serve as a counter-argument or at least a point of clarification against the idea that a constant observer was necessary for the universe to function or persist. He explained that the quantum Zeno effect was a phenomenon in quantum mechanics where the act of frequent measurement could prevent the evolution of a quantum system. This happened because the measurement method was prepared in such a way that it tested that it would observe the particle in the initial state, and in the case that it did measure it there, that kind of measurement, in effect, actually undid any tiny deviations from the initial state. Basically, the measurement disturbed the particle and made it move faster towards the maximum of the probability density on the interval that was measured. If the universe required a constant observer in the quantum sense, it could actually hinder natural processes rather than allow them to unfold smoothly. For instance, continuous observation might prevent the candle from burning rather than enabling it to do so. The quantum Zeno effect highlighted how observation in quantum mechanics could disrupt natural evolution, challenging the idea that a conscious constant observer was needed for the universe to function. He clarified that in quantum mechanics, observation was not just seeing with one's eyes. It meant a strong, projective measurement that forced a system into a definite state. For the Zeno effect to occur, one would have to make extremely rapid, precise, repeated quantum measurements. Ordinary sensory perception did not operate at that level. William posited that the one could be imagined as having complete perception of the global vacuum field. Therefore, it could infer the interactions of the fluctuations with every particle at every instant. Then it could infer the exact path of a particle, whereas to beings within the material world, it only appeared probabilistic. Frederic considered that and clarified that although the particle would be constantly interacting with quantum fluctuations of the vacuum, these interactions did not trigger the quantum Zeno effect because they were not equivalent to repeated measurements. The Zeno effect arose only when a system was subjected to a sequence of strong, well-defined measurements that undid any deviations from the initial state, preventing natural evolution. By contrast, vacuum fluctuations were part of the unitary dynamics of quantum fields. They continuously perturbed particles in a reversible, coherent way without collapsing their wave functions into classical outcomes. In other words, the vacuum entangled with the system but did not permanently record the state of the system, so the particle's state remained free to evolve. When a particle interacted with quantum fluctuations, it caused a local, temporary distortion of the vacuum's energy and structure around the particle. This distortion was the physical manifestation of the particle's field and how it interacted with other particles. Once the particle moved away, the polarized fluctuations quickly annihilated, and the local vacuum state returned to its ground state. The vacuum did not remember that the particle was there in the same way a recording medium does. Therefore, no information about the particle was irreversibly stored in the vacuum itself. As interactions with the vacuum were described by unitary operators, it required non-unitary operators to be irreversible. In a lab, non-unitary operators of measurements could be carefully conducted and thereby create the Zeno effect. These measurements were fundamentally unitary, but they became non-unitary when discarding the coupling of the environment with the system. He clarified that awareness did not require a classical record. The one could be present to the global field of fluctuations in the moment without recording it and thus without freezing it as a consequence of the Zeno effect. Linus asked if quantum fluctuations carried any information at all. Frederic told him that the local vacuum stat carried infinite potential information. He explained that the Reeh-Schlieder theorem stated that every quantum state of the global vacuum could be approximated to arbitrary degree by locally applying certain operators on the local vacuum. This was an influence on the global vacuum based on transformations of the local vacuum. However, the operators required to achieve such transformations were not generally unitary, meaning they could not always be physically realized as genuine measurements. The types of non-unitary measurements that were not possible to influence the local vacuum in a way that generated an arbitrary, globally desired state were those that required unphysical resources, specifically those demanding infinite energy or infinite time. All transformations of the local vacuum that would create non-negligible distortions in the global vacuum state were physically unrealizable. William recalled the proof of the soul's inherent knowledge that they had proposed when they met Charlie at the town square. He brought up the idea that the soul's inherent knowledge was the intuitive reflection of the vacuum's infinite potentiality. He said that the vacuum contained the potential for all possible informational states before any measurement. Likewise, he argued, the soul contained the potential all possible perceptual structures before any conscious thought or memory. Linus agreed, noting that the soul's perceptual capabilities could not be empirical since it preceded experience itself. Instead, it was inherently ontological. Frederic made it clear that globally the universe was coherent and only unitary operations which preserved coherency were allowed globally. Therefore, in principle, the vacuum could generate every possible coherent state by acting on the vacuum by unitary means. These states could give the soul its capabilities for perception of the universe. Linus asked how the one could be aware of the quantum fluctuations in order to be aware of the instantaneous interaction with real particles. Gabriel answered that the one was aware of every part of itself, and since quantum fluctuations was part of itself, it could derive their behavior from its own self-awareness. Because it fully comprehended itself, it simultaneously comprehended the fluctuations as expressions of its own essence. Gabriel proceeded to say that the one was self-aware, but there was nothing outside of itself, so it was totally aware of everything. The one as only self-awareness meant it was devoid of any object, process, or distinction between subject and object. It was not aware of anything outside itself because there was nothing other than itself. It was pure, non-relational awareness, existing as its own essence. He expanded, saying, limited awareness often involved a reflective process, where an I thought about my awareness. The one did not involve such processes. Reflection, as understand, implied a subtle duality, one part of the mind observing another. The one, being only self-awareness, transcended this entirely. The one's awareness was not a dynamic act of knowing. The one was absolute knowing by being. It did not act on anything, became anything, or experienced anything. It simply was the ground of all reality, the source of all potentialities, without itself being a thing among things. There was no distinct knower, knowing, or known in the one. Rather, in a single act of self-illumination, the one was the being that embodied knowing itself perfectly and was delighted in that knowing. It was not a consciousness. It was pure eternal self-awareness. There was no other to be aware of, since the one was the singular, unified reality. Linus asked Gabriel how to inherit the sacred knowledge of the soul. Gabriel answered that to align with the true nature of existence, one must achieve liberation. He said that liberation was not achieved through accumulating knowledge, but by dissolving the illusion of separateness. The self was not a knower observing a world, but the awareness in which all appearances arose. Thus, pure awareness was not a higher form of knowledge, but the intelligence in which knowledge appeared and dissolved. Thus, radical insight may emerge not from concept formation, but from contemplative silence in which form dissolved. Truth was achieved through pure awareness. It required stillness, not effort. The process was not driven, but allowed. It could not be forced or controlled in any way. Truth was not the result of accumulation, comparison, or conceptual achievement. It was the revelation that arises in the absence of the conditioned observer. As long as the self stands apart from what it observed, reality was fractured, altered through memory and thought. But in pure awareness, there was no longer a self apart, only the direct, unmediated unfolding of what was. This state could not be reached through effort, for effort was born of becoming. It was only in stillness, in the silence that needed nothing, that truth may blossom, like a flower that opens with the morning light, not for applause, not through will, but because it was its nature to bloom. So too does truth emerge when the mind no longer interferes. Awareness without judgment, without identity, without expectation, was the soil of liberation. He expanded that when the mind was measuring and comparing, it was engaged in a process of evaluation against a known standard or a desired outcome. This often led to judgment or a sense of lack. True wonder, however, arose when the mind stopped this evaluative process and simply received what was. It was an appreciation of something for its inherent being, not its relative value. It did not need to be measured against anything else. It simply was. To observe without evaluating was to see without distortion. Evaluation was comparison, and comparison was the root of conflict. It split the world into what was and what should be. The moment one judged, one separated oneself from the thing one observed and superimposed one's past upon it. Expectation was the projection of a should onto reality. It was the mind trying to force reality to conform to a preconceived mental image. Wonder, in contrast, was an openness to the unforeseen and the given. It was the moment when reality was beyond our expectations, when our mental fictions dissolve. If one expected a specific outcome, one was not in a state of wonder. One was in a state of anticipation or demand. Wonder thrived in the absence of a defined future that the mind was trying to chase. He concluded that intelligence was not the accumulation of knowledge. It was the ability to see without division. This seeing was free of desire, free of identity, and free of expectation. It was not passive, it was profoundly alive. In such seeing there was no observer, only awareness, clear and whole. This was why the highest form of intelligence was not thought but perception. It was the light of attention in which peace and freedom converged, not as goals, but as the natural radiance of a mind that did not interfere. Thus, he said, wonder was the result of unconscious contemplation, an unfolding rather than a construction. In its early stages, seeds of thought should be consciously planted, simple insights, unresolved questions, paradoxes held open rather than resolved. Over time, these seeds would interbred beneath the surface of awareness, fusing in unexpected ways. What later emerged into consciousness was not a linear argument, but a living synthesis, new ideas born from the silent tension of many. These intuitions could then be shaped and refined into a coherent framework. The wonder was not a report of what was known from the beginning, but the gradual revealing of what was always waiting to be seen. Kenneth pointed out that even though meditating on various ideas sounded relaxing, they only had so long until the earth would be ripped apart by tidal forces as it came crashing into the sun. They did not have time to ponder over various things until some of them, by some miracle, found out how to pass their trial. Gabriel laughed and said that they did not need a lot of time. He had already done the work needed for them to pass the trial. As long as they listened to his teachings, they could be sure that they would be able to pass their trial. Lyra angrily looked at Kenneth and said that he should not have interrupted the great teacher. Kenneth was embarrassed and muted himself. Linus asked how they could be sure that the teachings would really save them. Gabriel responded that the teachings was a history of the world they inhabited. They now knew about the hypostases of reality starting from the one and ending in the material world. As all hypostases below the one practices epistrophe to become in favor of the one, it would be dumb of them not to practice the same contemplation of the whole of creation that everything participates in. He asked rhetorically if a creator would not forgive a soul which worshipped the creation. Linus said that they had been taught and contemplated a lot of knowledge, but he asked how they would know what specific knowledge would set them free. Gabriel responded that all the knowledge was part of the process. One needed to learn the fundamentals in order to grasp the bigger picture. He proclaimed that just as ocean waves varied in height and intensity, experiences differed in significance, emotional weight, and impact. Some experiences may feel monumental, while others seemed trivial, yet all were part of the larger sea of existence. In other words, the way that the ignorant felt and the way the wise felt was ultimately negligible, because both were part of creation itself, which mattered infinitely more. The subjective emotional weight or the external outcome of any event did not occur to pure awareness. Whether one felt joy or pain, or whether one succeeded or failed in a worldly endeavor, that was negligible. The trial was the only way to dissolve the fractured self, which was the root of all separation. He said that with more teaching, they would soon all be able to dissolve their fractured self. Gabriel continued, saying that instant transformation was the sudden awakening of free will's highest expression, the mind fully attending without judgment or attachment, perfectly embodying the will of God. It was the moment when inner conflict ceased and the soul aligned with the forces of the good. This awakening was not earned by effort or accumulated knowledge, but arose spontaneously when the mental barriers of identity, desire, and expectation dissolve. Through this transformation, right response arose effortlessly, manifesting the pure emanation of the one within the finite world. In essence, instant transformation provided the mechanism or the lived experience of how one embodied this philosophical framework. It was not a gradual ascent, but a sudden qualitative shift that occurred when one truly aligned with the will of God as mindful attention and released the ego's grip on control, expectation, desire, and identity. This alignment led to that unified, harmonious state of being. He added that they would all go through instant transformation once they were ready to embody the teachings. At that point, the One would welcome them to the new earth, and they would live there for eternity. William, Kenneth, and Linus spoke with each other and doubted that Gabriel teachings were the real answer to passing the trial, as others they had met had also claimed that they knew the ultimate truth. But they agreed that they had nowhere else to go, so Gabriel was their best option for survival. They would do their best in listening to his teachings, as it could establish the groundwork for their salvation. However, they were on a clock, since soon they would be separated from everyone, and meet the same fate as the stonified beings in the alternative world.